liberal left's, this is our final tweet. Our democracy is diminished when it comes to who can spend more on commercials rather than having to debate the issues. Thank you, Philip Bump, for joining us this morning. You can see his piece on theatlantic.com. And now the House is in session, live coverage here on C-SPAN.
13th, 2013. I hereby appoint the Honorable Vicky Hartzler to act as Speaker Pro Tempore on this day. Signed, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Pursuant to the order of the House of January 3, 2013, the Chair will now recognize members from lists submitted by the majority and minority leaders for morning hour debate. The Chair will alternate recognition between the parties, with each party limited to 1 hour, and each member other than the majority and minority leaders and the minority whip limited to 5 minutes each, but in no event shall debate continue beyond 11:50 a.m. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Turner, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Yesterday in Dayton, I hosted a community forum regarding the impacts of sequestration on Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in the Dayton community. We had a distinguished group of local leaders who participated in the event. The expert panel included Colonel Cassie B. Barlow, 88th Air Base Wing and Installation Commander, Jeffrey Hoagland, President and CEO of the Dayton Development Coalition, Chris Kirshner of the Dayton Chamber of Commerce, and Carl Francis of Dayton Defense, a nonprofit group that is an advocacy group for the defense community in Dayton, Ohio. Each of these local leaders explained how sequestration has affected our community in 2013 and what the effect would be if the sequester continues. For a community like Dayton, with such a strong relationship at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Ohio's largest single-site employer, the message was devastating. The Budget Control Act of 2011, which I voted against, was signed into law on August 2, 2011. The Budget Control Act established a series of spending caps and forced reductions designed to indiscriminately reduce government spending by nearly $2 trillion over 10 years. These forced reductions, also known as sequestration, greatly impact our national security by requiring the Department of Defense to reduce its budget by roughly $500 billion. Already in its second year, this poorly conceived and flawed process continues to compromise our defense capabilities and greatly impact military communities like Dayton, Ohio. Reducing federal spending is important, but the sequester, as proposed by President Obama, applies 50% of the cuts to less than 18% of the spending. The Department of Defense represents less than 18% of overall federal spending. Due to the President's sequester, this year roughly 14,000 Air Force civilian men and women have been furloughed in the state of Ohio as a direct result of the sequester. These forced furloughs have not only cost our state tens of millions of dollars in lost revenue, but has negatively impacted nearly 30,000 men and women who work at Wright-Patterson and reside in our community. If allowed to continue, I fear the effects of sequestration will devastate the region and potentially result in the loss of 13,000 jobs. The loss of jobs matched with reductions in spending could cost our community in Dayton roughly $8.6 billion. While it's important to note the impacts to Dayton, we must also take into consideration the impacts to our national security and the future of our country. The President promised sequester would not happen, and yet the Department of Defense suffers under the effects of these drastic cuts. As many of the experts pointed out, sequestration will greatly compromise military readiness and modernization for years to come. Without a ready and able force, our military will no longer possess the capabilities necessary to rapidly and effectively respond to conflicts around the globe. During recent testimony before the House Armed Services Committee, the various service chiefs have made numerous statements outlining the devastating effects. Of note, the Army has been forced to cancel all combat training center rotations for those combat brigade teams not slated to deploy to Afghanistan or to be part of a global response force. That means that only 2 out of 42 combat Army brigades are fully trained and ready to deploy in a crisis. The Navy has canceled multiple ship deployments as a result of the devastating budget cuts, including the USS Truman Carrier Strike Group that was scheduled to deploy to the Middle East earlier this year. Due to the cuts in training and maintenance, we have had to reduce deterrent presence in order to retain the ability to surge our ships if needed in a crisis. Important modernization efforts are also taking a hit as a result of sequestration. Air Force leaders have told Congress that modernization forecasts are bleak. These modernization efforts are critical, as many of our assets in our inventories are decades old. It is imperative that we find spending cuts to offset the sequestration on the Department of Defense. Our military leaders have come to Congress on numerous occasions to explain the limitations the budget cuts are putting on our national security. It is legislative malpractice for this Congress to continue to put our nation at greater risk. The President needs to come to this Congress with a proposal to offset his sequestration in a responsible manner so the Department of Defense can be restored, our national security protected, and the community of Dayton, Ohio, no longer suffering the effects of sequestration. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Holt, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today as a member of the Safe Climate Caucus to say that climate change is making extreme weather worse and costing us in lives and dollars. Last week, Typhoon Haiyan, the strongest storm to make landfall in recorded history, struck the Philippines with sustained winds of almost 200 miles per hour, and thousands reported dead and missing. Haiyan, Sandy, Irene, Katrina, wildfires, floods, droughts. If you flip a coin 20 times, it's possible that an honest coin will land on heads every time. But you should start to suspect that there's something wrong with that coin. Sure, the recent extreme weather events might be coincidence, but as superstorms continue again and again, you should suspect that something is wrong with our climate. We should begin fixing our broken world, not pretending that all is well. This week marks the beginning of the 19th UN Climate Change Conference in Warsaw, where representatives from more than 190 nations will be discussing climate change and how the world should be responding. For international climate negotiations to succeed, the U.S. should take the lead, and leading internationally will require us to start here at home. I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, for 5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, this summer the biggest fire in the history of the Sierra Nevada mountains burned 400 square miles of forest land. The fire left behind an unprecedented swath of environmental devastation that threatens the loss not only of the affected forest land for generations, but sets events in motion that could threaten the surrounding forests for many years to come. The fire also left behind as much as 1 billion board feet of dead timber on federal land that could be sold to raise hundreds of millions of dollars, money that could then be used to replant and restore the devastated forests. In addition, processing that timber would help to revive the economy of the stricken region. But time is already running out. Within a year, the value of the timber rapidly declines as the wood is devoured by insects and rot. And that's the problem. Cumbersome environmental reviews and the litigation that inevitably follows will run out the clock on this valuable asset until it becomes worthless. Indeed, it becomes worse than worthless. It becomes hazardous. Bark and wood-boring beetles are already moving in to feast on the dead and dying timber. And a population explosion of pestilence can be expected if those dead trees remain. The beetles won't confine themselves to the fire areas, posing a mortal threat to the surrounding forests in the years ahead. By the time the normal bureaucratic reviews and lawsuits have run their course, what was once forest land will have already begun converting to brush land. And by the following year, reforestation will become infinitely more difficult and expensive. Within 2 years, several feet of brush will have built up, and the smaller trees will begin toppling on this tinder. It's not possible to build a more perfect fire stack than that. Intense second-generation fires will take advantage of this fuel, sterilizing the soil, eroding the landscape, fouling the watersheds, and threatening the surrounding forests for many years to come. Without timely salvage and reforestation, we know the fate of the Sierras because we've seen the result of benign neglect after previous fires. The trees don't come back for many generations. Instead, thick brush takes over the land that was once shaded by towering forests. The brush quickly overwhelms any seedlings struggling to make a start. It replaces the diverse ecosystems supported by the forests with scrub brush. For this reason, I've introduced H.R. 3188, which waives the time-consuming environmental review process and prevents the endless litigation that always follows. It authorizes federal forest managers, following well-established environmental protocols for salvage, to sell the dead timber and to supervise its careful removal while there is still time. The hundreds of millions of dollars raised can then be directed toward replanting the region before layers of brush choke off any chance of forest regrowth for generations to come. It's modeled on legislation authored by Democratic Senator Tom Daschle for salvaging dead and dying trees in the Black Hills National Forest, a measure credited with speeding the preservation and recovery of that forest. Now, this legislation has spawned lurid tales from the activist left of uncontrolled logging in the Sierras. Nothing could be further from the truth. This legislation vests full control of the salvage plans with federal forest managers, not the logging companies. It leaves federal foresters in charge of enforcing salvage plans that fully protect the environment. The left wants a policy of benign neglect. Let 250,000 acres of destroyed timber rot in place, surrender the ravaged land to beetles, and watch contentedly as the forest ecosystem is replaced by scrubland. Yes, without human intervention, the forests will eventually return, but not in the lifetimes of ourselves, our children, or our children's children. If we want to stop the loss of this forest land, and if we want to control the beetle infestation before it explodes out of control, the dead timber has to come out soon. If we take it out now, we can generate the funds necessary to suppress brush buildup, plant new seedlings, and restore these forests for the use and enjoyment of our children. If we wait for the normal bureaucratic reviews and delays, we will have lost these forests to the next several generations. That is a choice. Congress must make that choice now, or nature will make that choice for us. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Puerto Rico, Mr. Pierluisi, for 5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, Monday was Veterans Day, when our nation pays tribute to those who have served honorably in the armed forces. Today, I rise to express my gratitude to the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines from Puerto Rico, both those who are living and those who have left us. Since World War I, almost a century ago, to Afghanistan today, American citizens from Puerto Rico have built a rich record of military service. If you visit any U.S. base, you will see warriors from Puerto Rico fighting to keep this nation safe, strong, and free. They serve as officers and enlisted personnel, as special operators, in infantry, artillery, and armored units, as pilots and aviation technicians, in intelligence, on ships and submarines, in combat support positions, and in every military specialty. In his book, Puerto Rico's Future, A Time to Decide, former U.S. Attorney General Dick Thornburg observed that historically, Puerto Rico has ranked alongside the top 5 states in terms of per capita military service. In the foreword to that book, former President George H.W. Bush noted, I quote, "This patriotic service and sacrifice of Americans from Puerto Rico touched me all the more deeply for the very fact they have served with such devotion, even while denied a vote for the President and members of Congress who determine when, where, and how they are asked to defend our freedoms," end quote. As I address this chamber, men and women from Puerto Rico are serving in harm's way in Afghanistan and other locations. Since the attacks of 9/11, island residents have deployed about 1,000 times in overseas contingency operations. Many have deployed on multiple occasions. Each time they go, they leave behind spouses, children, and parents. As veterans will tell you, military life requires enormous sacrifice from their loved ones, those quiet heroes who support our uniformed personnel, who must live and work in their absence, and who pray for their safe return. On Veterans Day, we honor not only those who fought, but their families as well. There is a frame on my office wall containing photographs of service members from Puerto Rico that have fallen in the last 12 years. I often look at those photos, row after row of young faces, usually posing in their dress uniforms against the backdrop of the American flag. Those images make me sad, but they also give me strength. They inspire me to keep working for my people. They remind me what courage is and what sacrifice means. And they help me remember why representing Puerto Rico in Congress is the greatest honor I have ever known. I have met many veterans from Puerto Rico. I have found that they value deeds over words. They expect their elected leaders to produce results, or at least to work tirelessly towards that end. I'm proud of the record we have compiled on behalf of veterans from Puerto Rico. We have obtained funding to renovate the VA hospital in San Juan, to improve existing clinics and build new clinics throughout the island, and to provide vehicles so that residents of our state veterans home can visit their families and travel to medical appointments. We also achieved Puerto Rico's inclusion in a federal initiative to encourage the hiring of unemployed veterans. And I am working to honor a military unit that perhaps best exemplifies the service that residents of Puerto Rico have rendered this nation. Congressman Bill Posey of Florida and I have introduced legislation to award the Congressional Gold Medal to the 65th Infantry Regiment, known as the Borinqueniers, a unit composed mostly of soldiers from Puerto Rico that overcame discrimination and won admiration for their performance in the Korean War. Our bill has nearly 160 bipartisan co-sponsors, and there is a companion bill in the Senate that has also garnered strong support. I hope all my colleagues will join me in honoring this special group of veterans. This Veterans Day, I renewed my commitment to fight for the men and women who have fought so valiantly for us, and I thank them from the bottom of my heart for their service. I do so again today. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Flores, for 5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to honor the 75th anniversary of the city of College Station, Texas. College Station has been and is the home to tens of thousands of Texas families, students, businesses, and residents throughout the years, and I'm proud to offer my congratulations on this milestone. College Station was an unincorporated community for over 60 years before officially being incorporated as a city on October 19, 1938. In 1869, the Houston and Texas Central Railway was built through the area, and in 1871, College Station was chosen as the location for what would eventually become one of the largest public universities in the nation, Texas A&M University. The city got its name because the A&M campus was the focal point of community development at the time. In 1877, the area was designated College Station, Texas by the Postal Service, deriving its name from the train station located to the west of the campus. Since incorporation in 1938, College Station's population has grown to over 97,000 today. Over the past 75 years, College Station has served as a vibrant, supportive, and safe community for thousands of families. Texas A&M University is still the city's main focal point and the largest employer in the city. The university is rich in tradition and history, and due to its supportive fan base, sporting events bring in hundreds of thousands of tourists each year. College Station is also the home to the George Bush Presidential Library and Museum, one of the region's most popular tourist attractions. College Station is a fast-growing city with a thriving economy. It has recently been recognized as one of the nation's best places for businesses, jobs, families, and retirees. College Station prides itself on having the 5th lowest property tax rate among similar-sized communities in the state of Texas, and the city was recently ranked number 5 nationally on Forbes' list of the best small places for businesses and careers. College Station is among the safest and most family-friendly places in Texas, maintaining one of the best safety ratings in the state. College Station has also been a community that comes together and shows support when needed. Whether it was the collapse of the Aggie bonfire in 1999 or the loss of one of our constables in August of last year, our community comes together in the midst of terrible adversities to support one another. The residents and leadership of College Station worked hard to make their city one of the best places in Texas to work, live, and maintain an enjoyable and fulfilling life. It is my honor to represent the residents of this great city. Madam Speaker, please join me in commemorating the city of College Station and its proud residents on their 75th anniversary. Before I close, I ask that all Americans continue to pray for our country during these difficult times and for the military men and women and first responders who protect her. God bless the American people, and God bless College Station, Texas. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster, for 5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I request to be able to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to honor Martel Langsdorff, who created the image of the now iconic Doomsday Clock for the June 1947 cover of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. The Bulletin was founded by a group of University of Chicago scientists who had worked on the Manhattan Project, including Martel's husband, physicist Alexander Langsdorff. Martel's clock remains a singular reminder of the risks that we face from nuclear weapons and the effects of climate change. A renowned landscape painter and longtime resident of Schaumburg, Illinois, Martel died at the age of 96 on March 26, 2013, and will be remembered tomorrow at the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists' 5th Annual Doomsday Clock Symposium here in our nation's capital. Fittingly titled, quote, Communicating Catastrophe, unquote, the symposium will reflect Martel's sensitivity to the urgency of existential threats and her brilliance in using art and design, quote, to move past the numbness and create new ways of feeling, just as we tap science for new ways of knowing, in the words of Bulletin Executive Director Kenneth Benedict. Martel's legacy continues as members of the Bulletin Science and Security Board annually assess the state of world affairs and use the hands of the clock to signal humanity's capacity to meet challenges of nuclear weapons and climate change. World attention to the Doomsday Clock confirms the impact of what designer Michael Bierut, in a 2010 tribute to Martel titled Designing the Unthinkable, called, quote, the most powerful piece of information design of the 20th century. Madam Speaker, I ask my colleagues to join me in honoring the late Martel Langsdorff for raising the world's awareness about grave threats, and also the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists for providing information and rational analysis that points to a safer world. And to close on a personal note, it was at one of Martel Langsdorff's annual peony parties at her garden in Schaumburg, during a long conversation with wise old lawyer and Bulletin stalwart Lowell Sacknoff, that was one of the first times that I began seriously considering my own stepping away from my career in science to begin one in public service. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Holding, for 5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, President Obama promised the American people that if you liked your health care plan, you could keep your health care plan, period. No exceptions. Now, as the Obamacare exchanges have opened and enrollment has begun, there are hundreds of thousands of people in North Carolina who are finding that the President's promise doesn't hold true. According to the North Carolina Department of Insurance, over 183,000 policies have already been terminated, impacting over 473,000 people and their families across the state. When Obamacare supporters talk about the new health care law, they focus on the number of people who previously did not have health care and will now be covered. What you don't hear them talk about is the people who already had health care and are losing it now. They don't talk about the canceled policies and the alternative plans offered that are vastly more expensive and far from comparable. This is extremely misleading, Madam Speaker, and this administration has demonstrated a lack of transparency when it comes to the real impacts of Obamacare. Madam Speaker, I have heard from hundreds of constituents whose health care plans are going up in cost or being canceled altogether. A man in his 60s from Zebulon, North Carolina, wrote to my office that his wife's current plan, which costs $292 a month, will be discontinued because it does not comply with Obamacare standards. She will be moved to a comparable plan that doubles her monthly payment. On top of the increased cost, the new plan is not tailored to their needs. The couple is in their 60s, retired, and their children are adults. Yet their new plan includes newborn care plus dental and vision for dependent children. A constituent from Cary, North Carolina, wrote in with similar concerns. He and his wife currently pay about $715 a month for their health care plan and were informed that it was being canceled. Their new plan will cost them double annually and will no longer include vision care, but they are now both covered for maternity care. He wrote that his present policy is better and more suited for two people in their 60s, and that it just doesn't seem quite fair that two people who have always been responsible and done without things in order to afford health care insurance and save enough to retire should now be faced with this. Madam Speaker, I agree. Men and women of all ages across my home state and the country are feeling the negative impacts of Obamacare. I received a letter from a mother in Wake Forest, North Carolina, who got a notice that her monthly premium for a family of four is going from $624 a month to $1,207 a month. This is as much as their mortgage payment. So now her family is forced to pay the steep increase or choose a plan that includes a smaller premium but with fewer benefits and much higher deductibles. So much for keeping the health care plan she liked. Another constituent from Cary wrote that a difference in cost between his current Blue Cross Blue Shield plan and the lowest option under Obamacare is about $700 a month, tripling his current rate. How is this comparable to the plan he already has and now cannot keep? Madam Speaker, these are real people who have real problems with Obamacare. President Obama needs to listen to North Carolinians and American families across the country. Stories like this indicate that what President Obama said simply wasn't true. People are being forced into plans that include coverage they don't need or want, and they are not being able to keep the doctors and plans they had for years. Obamacare gives little choice and puts many in an impossible financial situation. Madam Speaker, this is simply not right. The American people want to be able to keep their doctors and health care plans that they were promised, and they were promised this by the President, and that promise should be upheld. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And we all have heard the promise over and over again, if you like what you have, you can keep it. It was probably the most often repeated promise since Barack Obama has been president. For 5 years now, that promise has been made, and unfortunately now millions of Americans are realizing that that promise has been broken over and over again. Over 100,000 Louisiana families are seeing that broken promise. In fact, I asked through social media, we had a social media site called Share with Steve, where we asked people in the Louisiana's 1st Congressional District to share their stories with me. And the stories that I've heard have been compelling and heartbreaking. And in fact, I started sharing some of those stories with the Secretary of Health and Human Services. When Secretary Sebelius was before us in the House Energy and Commerce Committee just a little over a week ago, I shared some of those stories with her. And of course, one of those stories was Sean from Covington. And I read Sean's story of the health care that he has now lost for his family because of the President's health care law. And I presented her the question, and of course you've got Secretary Sebelius, who is running the President's health care law, and all of these broken promises that we're hearing about. And I said, what would you tell Sean, Madam Secretary, who has now lost the good health care he has for his family, when you promised him that he'd be able to keep that health care? And unfortunately, all we got was a smug response from a bureaucrat in Washington, and her response to Sean was, well, you can just go shop around in the health care exchange. Well, first of all, that's not the promise
that she and the President made to Sean. The President promised Sean he could keep his health care if he liked it. And Sean likes his health care and doesn't want to lose it, and even more, doesn't now want to have to go to some website that doesn't even work to go buy a plan that his family doesn't need. And what Sean conveyed to me after that interaction with the Secretary was that what he's being presented now are options that are even more expensive and don't include the things, that the kind of coverage that his family wants. So I think what's most insulting to Americans is not only now that they're losing that health care, that President Obama broke that promise, that sacred promise between a doctor and a patient, but now you're hearing this elitist Washington politician response where you've got these bureaucrats and politicians in Washington telling people like Sean, we didn't think your plan was good enough for you. And so not only have they broken the promise, but now they're deciding what they think is good enough for a patient and their doctor. And so a family in a place like Covington, Louisiana, that I represent, or all around the country, that had good health insurance, that liked the plan that they had, are being told not only can't they keep it, but that some Washington bureaucrat didn't think their plan was good enough, even though they thought their plan was good enough. So this is what's wrong with government-run health care. This is why we fought this bill back in 2009 when it was going through the Energy and Commerce Committee and here on the House floor, when you had then Speaker Nancy Pelosi saying, you got to pass the bill to find out what's in it. Of course, American families are now seeing what's in it, and they don't like what they are seeing in this bill. Later this week, we're bringing up a bill on the House floor that I'm proud to co-sponsor that allows you to keep the plan that you have if you like it. Of course, the President's promise really should have been if Barack Obama doesn't like your plan, if Barack Obama likes your plan, you can keep it, because that's the only way you can keep your plan is if the federal government approves of it, even if you like it and you lose it. And so what we're also seeing, of course, over in the Senate side and even here on the House floor, many people who voted for the President's health care law are acting as if they had no idea this was going to happen. Of course they knew this was going to happen. If you read the bill, you could tell that people would lose the good health care they like. There were reports coming out in 2010 that said millions of Americans will lose the health care they like. And yet now you have senators over there and even some House members who voted for the President's health care law acting like they had no idea this was going to come to pass. Of course they knew that millions of Americans would lose the good health care that they liked. They just didn't think maybe that people would realize that it was the President's health care law that caused it and hold them accountable. And so now people are starting to be held accountable as they should. But, Madam Speaker, there is a better way. In fact, I'm proud to have led an effort to bring forward the American Health Care Reform Act, a true alternative to the President's health care law that actually starts addressing the problems to lower costs, to allow people to keep the good health care plans that they like, and to give people real options. In fact, our bill has over 100 co-sponsors now, including medical doctors who serve in Congress, who helped draft this bill, who understand that the doctor-patient relationship should continue to be maintained and be that sacred relationship that it used to always be before the government started coming in between people's health care, before IRS agents started coming in between people's health care. And so this bill allows people to buy insurance across state lines, giving people real flexibility, real choice, real competition in health care where people will be competing for your business to dramatically lower costs, to allow people to have the option to buy their own health care instead of going through their company, and they'll be able to have the same tax benefits that a company gets. So if they buy a health care plan on their own that's better than what their employer provides, they'll be able to deduct that cost, which they can't do today. It allows small businesses and even individuals to pool together and get the buying power of a large corporation. This is the way we should be doing this, Madam Speaker, not this government-run approach. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California. All right. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Thompson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, millions of Americans are now experiencing firsthand the failures of a massive undertaking to roll out the Affordable Care Act. Well-intentioned, our colleagues who had a Democrat supermajority in the White House, the Senate, and this House pushed through a partisan bill, ignoring warnings of those like myself who have worked in the health care field for decades. Prior to being elected to Congress, I spent nearly 3 decades in a nonprofit health care setting, serving my neighbors who were facing life-changing disease and disability. When it was time to weigh in on public policy, members like me were muzzled. We were told to pass a bill to see what was in it. Well, that's exactly what happened, despite our continued dissent. Phones are ringing off the hooks in members' offices. Constituents who have lost their health insurance policies and experienced unaffordable premium hikes are angry. They were made a promise by the President that they could keep their health plans. Now, reportedly, more than 5 million individuals have lost their policies. Undoubtedly, this is just the beginning of Americans not being able to keep the insurance that they like. Now, one of my constituents, Sam from Erie County, Pennsylvania, has been affected. He has been on the same policy that's provided him with adequate coverage, exactly what he was looking for years. He no longer has access to that coverage. Or Lisa and her husband, both self-employed and hailing from Punxsutawney in Jefferson County, Pennsylvania. They have 5 children, 2 in college, 1 in high school, and 2 working. After receiving notice that their effective and affordable health insurance policy was canceled, they've now been saddled with cost increases of over $20,000 a year. How about John from Clearfield County, who emailed my congressional office this week after being informed by his insurer that due to changes under the Affordable Care Act, his policy is now canceled. He owns a small business that no longer qualifies for the group plan under the law's requirements. Then there's Sonia from Northeast Pennsylvania, right on the shores of Lake Erie. She's had the same policy for the last 4 years, and it's being canceled. She stated that it is unfair she should have to buy more expensive insurance. Not to mention, she says, it will cost much more over the long run when you factor in her new deductible. Madam Speaker, this is an outrage. These are just several of countless examples, I would say endless examples, of real harm being experienced by hardworking Americans, my constituents, as a result of this flawed law. Madam Speaker, the time I've been granted on this floor is not sufficient for me to share the growing number of voices from the 5th District of Pennsylvania who are having their policies canceled and being forced to buy insurance that they can't afford, that they don't want, and they don't need. Those at the White House that masterminded this catastrophic attack on insurance affordability and choice released their preliminary numbers for winners and losers yesterday. Nationwide, roughly 100,000 have obtained insurance policies through the national and state exchanges combined. Many of these individuals, unfortunately, are now experiencing the sticker shock of significant costs when premiums and deductible expenses are combined and considered. The sad part is that these are the winners. That is just how bad this health care law is. Americans deserve access to health insurance that they choose and can afford. Madam Speaker, a large block of members in this body are standing up and putting forward solutions to these failures, including some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. Senator Mary Landrieu, a Democrat from Louisiana, recently announced she would propose legislation to ensure all Americans could keep their existing insurance coverage under Obamacare. But it's, quote, it's not just red state Democrats, as Politico reports today. Senator Dianne Feinstein, a Democrat from California, yesterday announced she would support the bipartisan effort to allow Americans to keep the plans they know and like. Unfortunately, Madam Speaker, these proposals are being put forward by my Democratic colleagues mean that we would have to change the law. Unfortunately, Senator Leader Reid doesn't like the optics of having this debate on its merits, even if it would help the Americans keep the insurance they know and like, as the President repeatedly promised. Now, I want to thank the growing number of my colleagues for doing what is right and placing good policy before politics. This law is flawed. It is sinking by its own weight. Now, we must act to fix its fatal flaws. If we don't, those who want to protect the political reputation of the White House will allow it to continue, no matter how much harm is caused upon the American people. Madam Speaker, the American people deserve better. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess until noon today.
Members taking a break now before starting their legislative work at noon Eastern. One bill on the calendar today seeking to combat fraudulent asbestos claims.